Do you ever think about the meals your grandparents ate to survive? These African American recipes turned scraps and faith into strength. What happens if we forget the taste of their survival? Watermelon rind stew turned scraps into supper, proving that nothing in a Southern kitchen ever truly went to waste. The white rinds, stripped of their bright red flesh, were peeled, chopped, and simmered slow with onions, peppers, and a touch of salt until they softened and soaked up every bit of flavor. The broth turned sweet and savory, carrying a light tang from the vegetables that made it comforting and familiar. It tasted like the kind of food that worked twice as hard as it needed to. Families who had little more than a pot and patience made meals like this stretch far and wide, feeding mouths with the humblest ingredients. Served over rice or spooned beside cornbread, it filled bellies and brought warmth to every table. The smell of the stew was soft and homely, rising through the kitchen with the sound of spoons tapping enamel bowls. Watermelon rind stew was living proof that the South did not just cook to survive, it cooked to remember. Every pot of it told a story about thrift, memory, and making beauty out of the overlooked. Potato peel pie came from kitchens that refused to let hunger win. Every saved peel was mashed with milk, onion, salt, and flour to make a filling that turned creamy once baked inside a crisp crust of leftover dough. It was a dish born from hands that knew how to stretch every harvest until there was nothing left to save. The smell of roasting potatoes drifted through small homes and fields, earthy and rich, the scent of supper and survival. No one thought it was strange to eat what others might throw away. They just called it dinner and thanked God for it. Potato peel pie was not fancy, but it held the taste of warmth and care in every bite. The browned edges crackled, the inside stayed soft, and the pie cooled slow on the windowsill like something precious. It was the very picture of Southern thrift, clever, kind, and stubborn in all the right ways. People did not just eat to live, they ate to remember who they were. Potato peel pie was comfort baked right into a crust, proof that love always found a way to feed a family. Sorghum coffee substitute was the South's answer when coffee beans disappeared from the pantry. Sorghum seeds were roasted dark until their smell turned smoky and rich, then ground fine and brewed just like coffee. The first sip tasted sweet and nutty, with a bitterness that woke you gently instead of jolting you. For farmers, mill workers, and early risers, it was warmth without the price tag, a mug full of patience, not luxury. People drank it before sunrise, sitting by wood stoves while the world was still quiet. It filled mornings with comfort and pride, showing that even when money ran short, ingenuity could still fill the cup. Grandmothers swore it gave better strength than real coffee ever could, and maybe it did, because it came from the soil they worked with their own hands. The color was deep amber, the aroma soft and familiar. Sorghum coffee was not a substitute at all. It was survival made drinkable. It reminded everyone that simplicity could be strong and that flavor did not need to come from far away. Collard green sandwiches were the working person's lunch, built for long days and calloused hands. Cold collard greens, left over from the night before, were pressed between thick slabs of cornbread still warm from the skillet. Sometimes there was bacon grease brushed inside for flavor, sometimes just salt and love. It was food meant to travel, sturdy, filling, and easy to eat between shifts or in the shade of a field. Every bite was smoky, tangy, and satisfying, a little taste of home wrapped in practicality. You did not need silverware or a plate, only the will to keep going. These sandwiches held the spirit of the South's hardest workers, people who made do with what they had and still made it taste like something fine. The greens gave strength, the bread gave comfort, and together they carried families through hard seasons. Collard green sandwiches were humble, yes, but they fed both body and pride. They proved that even leftovers could tell a story of perseverance and belonging. Cracklin cornbread fritters were the sound of joy sizzling in a cast-iron pan. Grandmothers would crumble leftover cornbread into a bowl, fold in bits of crispy pork cracklins, and drop spoonfuls into hot oil until they puffed golden brown. The kitchen would fill with the smell of salt, corn, and smoke. a scent that felt like home. Each fritter was small enough to hold in your hand, but big enough to make you close your eyes and smile. The first bite crackled, the second melted, the third reminded you how lucky you were to taste something so simple and perfect. People ate them hot off the stove or packed them for work the next morning. They were comfort disguised as convenience, proof that flavor did not come from what you bought, but from what you remembered. Cracklin cornbread fritters carried the soul of Southern cooking, thrift, warmth, and a little mischief. They were not leftovers. They were a second chance done right. Mustard green chowder was the kind of soup that filled the air before it filled the bowl. It began with bacon ends and onions cooked down until the scent turned smoky and sweet. Then handfuls of chopped mustard greens were stirred in to simmer slowly. No cream, no fancy stock, just patience and a steady hand. The greens softened, giving the broth a peppery bite and a deep, earthy color. It was simple food, yet it carried layers of flavor that comforted tired families. Served with a wedge of cornbread or poured over rice, it was as rich as anything served in fine restaurants. The taste was bold but kind, a spoonful of history that reminded people they could still find warmth even when money was thin. Mustard green chowder was thrift turned into nourishment, a pot full of pride and resourcefulness. Molasses, glazed carrots, and onions brought sweetness to supper when sugar was hard to come by. Grandmothers simmered sliced onions and carrots together in a skillet, then stirred in a spoon of dark molasses until everything shone with a sticky brown glaze. The smell alone made the house feel like Sunday afternoon even in the middle of the week. The molasses clung to the vegetables, giving them a rich, smoky sweetness that balanced their earthiness. It was the kind of side dish that needed no main course, just an appetite and a little gratitude. When sugar ran out, molasses became magic, stretching across biscuits, beans, and vegetables alike. This dish tasted like memory, slow, deep, and honest. It reminded people that hardship could still carry comfort if you knew where to look. Molasses glazed carrots and onions were not just a side. They were a statement that Southern kitchens never stopped finding sweetness even in the darkest times. Rice and egg gravy made the poor man feel rich and the weary feel full again. Eggs were beaten into hot milk and drippings, thickened slowly over a wood stove until the mixture turned smooth, glossy, and golden as dawn. The smell drifted through small homes, wrapping everyone in the comfort of something familiar and kind. There was no meat in it, but somehow it carried the depth and warmth of a feast, the buttery flavor coating every spoonful like quiet reassurance. Each bite felt heavier than it should have, not from the ingredients, but from the love that went into making it. The rice soaked up the gravy, turning plain grains into a meal that could fill a house with gratitude. It was passed around in one bowl, steaming and steady, feeding hands that worked hard and hearts that needed hope. Rice and egg gravy was more than thrift. It was proof that even in the leanest times, creativity turned scarcity into satisfaction. It taught that survival could taste gentle, that a humble kitchen could hold abundance without excess. Every spoonful carried the story of endurance and care, a reminder that simple food could still taste like grace. Corncob jelly was sweetness made from what everyone else would have thrown away. When the kernels were long gone, grandmothers gathered the empty cobs, boiled them until the water blushed golden, and stirred in sugar until it gleamed like melted sunlight. The scent filled the air, soft and buttery, with a whisper of summer still clinging to the pot. Once cooled, it set into a glossy jelly, clear as amber and delicate as spun glass. Spread on biscuits or cornbread, it shimmered in the morning light, tasting faintly of cornfields and warm days. There was something almost magical in the way it turned waste into beauty, a sweet defiance against hunger and hardship. Each jar of corncob jelly held more than flavor. It held proof that nothing in a Southern kitchen was ever truly useless. It was passed between neighbors, sold at church socials, or gifted with a ribbon tied around the lid. For families who had little, it brought luxury to breakfast and hope to the table. Corncob jelly was not just food, it was gratitude preserved. Dandelion leaf salad was the first taste of spring after long winters of waiting. Before gardens ripened and store shelves filled, families went out with baskets to gather the wild greens sprouting between stones and fences. The leaves were sharp and bitter, full of life, dressed with bacon grease and a drizzle of warm vinegar to tame their sting. When topped with sliced eggs or onions, the salad turned humble foraged greens into something worth celebrating. It carried the smell of open air, of wet soil and renewal, of hard work rewarded. Eating it was a kind of homecoming, the body remembering the land it came from. Every bite crackled with freshness, earthy and alive, tasting like the world waking up. It was not fancy, but it was honest, a meal earned by hand and heart. Dandelion leaf salad reminded everyone that food was more than what you planted. It was what you noticed, what you respected, what you were grateful for. It was a meal that whispered of beginnings and belonging, both wild and tender at once. Sweet potato coffee cakes were the color of sunrise and the taste of endurance. Made from mashed sweet potatoes, a handful of flour, and a splash of milk, they puffed up in hot skillets like small golden pillows. The scent that rose was warm and earthy, a mix of sweetness and smoke that could fill a house with comfort. Grandmothers flipped them by hand, humming as they cooked, serving them plain or with a drizzle of syrup when luck allowed. They were soft in the middle, crisp at the edges, and heavy enough to quiet hunger for hours. Sweet potato coffee cakes carried the sweetness of what the land gave, and the pride of what hands could make from nearly nothing. They were served with black coffee, the kind brewed strong enough to wake the weary and steady the spirit. Each bite reminded families that simple ingredients could bring more joy than expensive ones ever could. Sweet potato coffee cakes were not dessert and not bread, but something that lived between both, soft with memory and strong with survival. They were the taste of mornings that began with hope, even when cupboards were thin and times were lean. Pigtail and lima bean stew was slow food in its truest form, built on time, patience, and thrift. Pigtails were boiled for hours, their marrow-rich flavor turning water into a broth so deep it could stand alone. Lima beans simmered alongside, soaking in the salt and smoke until they burst open, creamy and thick. The stew bubbled low on wood stoves, perfuming small kitchens with the smell of comfort and labor. Nothing fancy went into it, yet it carried the fullness of a feast, rich enough to make the poorest table feel blessed. Pigtail and lima bean stew was a recipe that taught patience, how to wait, how to stir, how to coax flavor from bone and bean. It was a dish for families who knew that good food took time, and time itself was a kind of love. When served, it clung to cornbread and filled bowls to the rim. The meat fell apart, the beans melted soft, and every spoonful told the story of making much out of little. Pigtail and lima bean stew was more than sustenance. It was gratitude made edible. Homemade syrup bread was born in kitchens where sugar, eggs, and butter had all run dry. Cooks would mix coarse flour with syrup water, baking it slow until it came out dark, sticky, and fragrant. The crust turned crisp while the inside stayed tender, sweetened not by plenty but by invention. It was a bread that tasted of molasses and hard work, the kind that made plain coffee taste richer. Every slice was heavy in the hand, soft in the mouth, and filled with the scent of survival. Families tore it apart with their fingers, letting the syrup glaze stick to their skin. It was eaten for breakfast or supper, depending on what the day offered, and always left you wanting one more bite. Homemade syrup bread taught cooks that sweetness did not come from sugar, but from persistence. It was a reminder that warmth could rise from even the barest pantry. When times were hardest, this bread made people feel human again, loved, fed, and home. Fried rice cakes with molasses drizzle were the small joy at the end of a long week. Leftover rice, pressed into rounds and fried golden in sizzling fat, turned crisp outside and soft inside like pancakes for the patient. Once stacked, they were drizzled with molasses, the dark syrup pooling between edges and soaking through the cracks. For children, it was the sweetest thing they knew, eaten with fingers sticky and laughter loud. Grown folks called it supper when cupboards ran empty, proof that a treat could still fill a stomach. The crackle of frying rice sounded like home, simple, rhythmic, reassuring. It was the sound of making something out of nothing and smiling through it anyway. Fried rice cakes with molasses drizzle turned leftovers into love and hardship into a kind of celebration. They were proof that sweetness was never out of reach as long as imagination stayed alive. Pickled pig's feet. Salad was a dish that startled the tongue but stayed in memory. The gelatinous cuts of pig's feet, slow cooked and cooled, were diced and tossed with onions, peppers, and a sharp vinegar dressing. It was a cold dish, tangy and bright, served in small bowls at Sunday gatherings or alongside biscuits. The flavor was bold, salty, sour, and strong enough to wake the senses. For some, it was a delicacy. For others, a taste they learned to love out of respect for what their elders cherished. It was food with character, no pretending, no disguising what it was. Pickled pig's feet. Salad reminded people that Southern cooking had no waste, no shame, only pride in the craft of using every part of what was given. It was eaten slow, with talk and laughter, a dish meant to be remembered as much as tasted. Oven-baked fish. Roe patties were a meal of river and resourcefulness. Fishermen brought home eggs from their catch, saving them for the women who knew how to turn them into gold. Mixed with cornmeal, herbs, and salt, they baked into cakes crisp at the edges and tender within. The taste was deep, briny, and nutty, like the river itself speaking through supper. In fishing towns, these patties were the pride of families who lived by the water, proof that every catch gave more than one meal. They were served hot, eaten straight from the pan, and shared before they cooled. Oven-baked fish, roe patties were humble but powerful, a testament to making nourishment from the overlooked. They filled bellies and hearts with gratitude for the day's work, turning what was nearly discarded into something worth celebrating. Turnip-top fritters were the green heartbeat of thrift. Made from chopped turnip greens, cornmeal, and salt, they sizzled in oil until brown and crisp, filling the room with a smell that was sharp and comforting. The taste was earthy and bright, with a bitterness that faded into warmth. These fritters took what was often tossed aside and made it into something worth gathering around. Grandmothers fried them by the dozen, stacking them high on paper towels to soak the grease. They were eaten hot, with fingers or forks, and gone before the next batch left the pan. Turnip-top fritters reminded families that waste was a choice and flavor was everywhere if you looked close enough. They were green, humble, and perfectly Southern. Cornmeal dumplings in ham broth were what turned a little pot of broth into a full meal. Bits of dough, made from cornmeal and water, were dropped into bubbling ham stock and left to swell and soften. They absorbed every bit of smoky salt and fat, turning light broth into thick comfort. The kitchen filled with the smell of ham and hearth, a scent that promised something steady. Served with greens or beans, it stretched one meal into two, proof that care could multiply food. Cornmeal dumplings in ham broth fed the tired, the young, and the hopeful alike, spoon by spoon. It was a dish that needed nothing more than a pot, a handful of meal, and patience. Three things Southern kitchens always had. Vinegar pie was born out of scarcity, but baked with the grace of tradition. When lemons were too dear or entirely missing from store shelves, Southern cooks reached for the vinegar jug, whisking a splash into eggs, sugar, and butter to mimic that sharp citrus tang. The mixture baked into a smooth, custard-like filling that shimmered gold under its flaky crust. Its scent filled the kitchen, rich with caramelized sugar and warmth, fooling guests into thinking it was lemon pie until the first bite proved otherwise. Tart and buttery, simple and refined, it was dessert by way of defiance, proving that lack could never defeat imagination. Vinegar pie stood on church supper tables beside fancier dishes and held its own with quiet pride. It was a baker's secret weapon, turning pantry scraps into something elegant enough for company. Every forkful carried a lesson, that sweetness could rise from struggle, and that comfort was never about cost, but creativity. Vinegar pie was more than a dessert. It was a Southern declaration that love and resourcefulness could make even the humblest pie taste like triumph. Black-eyed pea cakes were the proud product of thrift, tradition, and an unshakable sense of flavor. Cooked black-eyed peas were mashed smooth, mixed with chopped onions, peppers, and a handful of cornmeal, then shaped into patties and fried until the edges turned crisp and brown. The smell alone, smoky, nutty, and rich, could pull a family from the porch to the kitchen. Served hot with mustard or a dash of hot sauce, they filled bellies and hearts in equal measure. They were meatless but mighty, full of protein and pride, feeding workers before long days in the field or factory. Every bite tasted of the South's soil and its history, humble yet powerful, born from necessity, but crafted with care. Black-eyed pea cakes reminded everyone that flavor didn't depend on plenty, but on patience, seasoning, and soul. They were living proof that even the simplest ingredients could create something golden, hearty, and unforgettable. Stewed rabbit with wild herbs was the kind of meal that came from both patience and the land itself. When grocery shelves were bare, families turned to the woods, hunting small game that could stretch into a week's worth of meals. The rabbit was cleaned and cut into pieces, then stewed slowly with onions, wild garlic, thyme, and sage picked fresh from the edges of fields. It simmered until the meat fell from the bone, the broth turning golden and rich. Every spoonful carried the scent of grass, earth, and smoke from the fire it cooked over. The flavor was mild yet wild, tasting of open air and effort. This dish was not about luxury. It was about knowing how to survive without giving up the comfort of good food. Children would sit quiet, waiting for their bowl, while elders talked about how every herb had a story of healing and endurance. Served with cornbread or a spoonful of rice, stewed rabbit with wild herbs tasted like survival turned into ritual. It was a reminder that the South's truest recipes were born not from plenty, but from respect for the land, for hunger, and for the art of making something honest out of hardship. Cane syrup custard was a dessert made from sweetness wrestled out of the soil. In the Deep South, when sugar was scarce or too costly, cane syrup became the heart of baking, thick and dark as molasses with a flavor both smoky and kind. Mixed with milk, a few eggs, and a pinch of salt, it baked into a soft custard that shimmered like caramel in the light. Grandmothers stirred it by hand, testing it with the back of a spoon until it coated perfectly. The smell was warm and deep, like toasted sugar and earth mingling in one breath. It was served warm, sometimes with cream if fortune allowed, but most often plain, humble, shining, complete. Every bite was smooth, rich, and satisfying, tasting of fields, labor, and the small sweetness that came at the end of long days. Cane syrup custard did not try to impress, it only needed to comfort. It was proof that love could be measured in spoons, not sugar, and that flavor came from memory as much as from ingredients. Green tomato relish, better known as chow chow, was the taste of late summer bottled for the months ahead. When gardens began to fade, cooks gathered every leftover vegetable they could find: green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and peppers, chopping them fine and boiling them in vinegar and spice. The air filled with tang and sweetness, a scent that meant both ending and preparation. Jars lined the counters, glowing shades of green and gold, ready to be stored for winter. This relish brightened dull meals, adding spark to beans, cornbread, and stews. It was a promise that even when gardens went bare, their flavor would live on. Chow chow was a recipe of gratitude and foresight, proof that nothing was wasted in a southern kitchen. It carried the taste of sunshine trapped in vinegar, of hands that refused to let any season slip away. Green tomato relish wasn't just a condiment, it was a safeguard, a memory of warmer days preserved with patience. Ham-bone cabbage rolls were the kind of dish that turned scraps into a celebration. Leftover ham bones, with just enough meat clinging on, flavored a pot of rice and onions that would later fill blanched cabbage leaves. Each roll was tied tight, nestled in broth, and baked until tender. The cabbage softened like silk, soaking up the smoky salt of the ham and the starch of the rice. The smell alone could fill a house with comfort before the first bite ever touched a plate. Families shared these rolls with quiet pride, knowing the recipe used everything and wasted nothing. Ham-boned cabbage rolls tasted like cleverness, the art of turning the last bit of one meal into the first bite of another. It was food for families who lived close to the land and closer to each other, a reminder that thrift, when done right, could taste like love. Onion skin tea was never meant for indulgence. It was born from empty cupboards and a mother's quiet resolve. When sickness crept through the house and money was nowhere to be found, women would save the papery skins of onions that most folks tossed away. They boiled them slow in a pot of water until the liquid turned amber, shimmering softly like honey in the firelight. The scent filled the air, earthy, faintly sweet, and strangely comforting. It was said to cure coughs and colds, to calm the nerves, and to soothe a restless heart. Whether it truly healed or not did not matter. Its warmth carried hope, and that was enough. Children drank it before bed, clutching tin cups as their mothers whispered that it would chase away the chill. Even when the tea cooled, it tasted like care, like someone had stopped long enough to remember you. Onion skin tea reminded families that healing did not always come from the doctor's hand, but from love, patience, and the will to make something gentle out of nothing. It was medicine brewed from faith, a reminder that comfort could bloom in even the poorest kitchens. Pumpkin and sorghum soup glowed like the heart of autumn itself. When the fields began to fade and the air turned cool, pumpkins were gathered from dusty patches, washed clean, and peeled by hand. Their orange flesh simmered slow in a pot of water thickened with sorghum, a dark syrup that deepened their sweetness and gave the broth its velvet weight. A pinch of salt and a dash of nutmeg brought balance to its warmth, filling small homes with the scent of harvest. It was served in chipped bowls, often with cornbread or biscuits, and eaten by lamplight after long days in the field. The flavor carried both sweetness and smoke, the kind of taste that lingered in memory long after the bowl was empty. Pumpkin and sorghum soup reminded families that abundance did not always mean plenty. Sometimes it simply meant enough. It turned a simple gourd into a feast, binding gratitude to every spoonful. It was a meal that made the cold months feel shorter and the long nights softer, proof that comfort, like kindness, came from what the earth willingly gave. Bread crust pudding was a dessert that rose from hardship and turned thrift into tenderness. No scrap of bread ever went to waste in a southern kitchen, not even the dry ends that seemed too far gone to save. Grandmothers gathered them in bowls, soaking them in milk, beaten eggs, and a touch of sugar. Sometimes a handful of apples or raisins was added, though often there was nothing but bread and hope. Baked until golden and crisp on top, the pudding puffed up light as memory, its scent filling the house with the comfort of vanilla and warmth. Each bite tasted like home, simple, soft, and sweet in its humility. Children scraped their spoons against the edges of the pan, chasing every last crumb. Bread crust pudding was proof that love could turn scarcity into satisfaction, that sweetness could bloom even in the leanest times. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to make a table feel full and a heart feel steady. In every home that made it, it became a quiet ritual, a way of saying, "We still have something good." It was the flavor of perseverance itself, baked golden and shared with gratitude. Peanut shell broth was perhaps the humblest creation to ever grace a southern kitchen table, a quiet miracle made from what most would sweep away without a second thought. After the peanuts were shelled, the dry husks were rinsed clean, boiled long in water, and strained until the liquid turned faintly brown and carried the scent of roasted earth. The result was thin but rich in spirit, a nutty, lightly sweet broth that seemed to hold warmth even when it cooled. Families would sip it plain or pour it over rice and collard greens to lend them a hint of flavor when butter and meat were nowhere to be found. It was a dish that asked for nothing more than patience and faith. Faith that even emptiness could give something back. The taste was subtle, earthy, and oddly comforting, like a whisper that said, "You still have enough." Peanut shell broth was more than survival food. It was an act of quiet defiance against hunger. In homes where the pantry echoed, it proved that creativity and courage could fill bellies as surely as meat and salt. It was passed down through word of mouth, never written, but always remembered, the taste of endurance itself. Stewed cow heel, known fondly as trotter stew, was a southern staple that rewarded time and tenderness. Cow heels, tough and gelatinous, were cleaned, seasoned, and simmered low and slow in iron pots filled with onions, celery, peppers, and broth. As hours passed, the meat softened and the liquid thickened into a glossy, silky stew that clung to spoons and coated every grain of rice it touched. The flavor was deep and savory, the kind that could turn a bare kitchen into a banquet hall through scent alone. Steam fogged up windows, carrying with it the smell of smoked spices and home. It was a dish of patience and pride, proving that even the most overlooked parts of an animal had value in the right hands. Grandmothers knew exactly how long to wait, stirring only when the broth whispered for attention. The result was nourishment, thick with memory, hearty, gelatin-rich, and endlessly comforting. Stewed cow heel filled bellies, soothed spirits, and reminded families that good food came not from wealth but from wisdom and will. Every bowl told a story of hands that worked hard and hearts that refused to waste what the earth provided. Roasted okra seeds were the sound of thrift meeting joy, the kind of snack that made scarcity taste like abundance. When money was short and peanuts cost too much, farmers gathered okra pods left to dry on the stalk, splitting them open to save every seed. The tiny pearls were washed, spread out on iron skillets, and roasted over low heat until they popped, darkened, and filled the kitchen with a smell like toasted nuts and soil after rain. A pinch of salt turned them into something simple yet irresistible, crunchy, smoky, and faintly sweet. Children would chew them by the handful, and workers carried jars of them to fields and factories alike. They were a snack that traveled easily, needed no sugar, and came entirely from the land's generosity. Roasted okra seeds proved that waste was only a matter of imagination. Out of empty pockets and sun-worn hands came something delicious, something to share, something to smile about. They were not just food, they were evidence that the South could turn even its scraps into stories worth savoring. Collard green potlikker soup was proof that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. After collard greens were boiled with ham hocks or smoked meat, the leftover broth was packed with nutrients and flavor. Families would save it, thicken it with beans, rice, or cornbread crumbs, and serve it as a soup. It turned what could have been discarded liquid into a meal that could stretch for days. Potlikker was praised for its richness and vitamins, especially during times when fresh vegetables were limited. Black families in the South cherished it as part of their food culture, a reminder that even scraps held value. The taste of potlikker soup was smoky, salty, and comforting, carrying both sustenance and heritage in every bowl. It reminded people that resourcefulness was a form of survival and strength. For many households, it was a dish that fed both body and spirit when times were most difficult. Burdock root stew speaks to the deep botanical knowledge carried by African cooks who could read the land for nourishment even when fields were bare. Burdock, a hardy root with a flavor similar to earthy artichoke, grew wild along fence rows and shaded ditches where other crops refused to thrive. Gatherers dug the long taproots with simple hand tools, scrubbed them clean, and sliced them thin before simmering them for hours with any garden greens or herbs that might be on hand. The slow cooking softened the root into a tender base for a broth that was both filling and rich in minerals. This practice echoed African and indigenous traditions of using wild roots as a staple during lean times. After emancipation, burdock continued to appear in rural foraging guides and folk remedies, admired for its subtle sweetness and sustaining qualities. Today, herbalists still value burdock for its nutrients, reminding us that what once served as a quiet survival food remains a symbol of resourcefulness and a connection to the untamed landscape of the American South. Collard green potlikker soup captured the very essence of slow cooking and careful stewardship. After hours of simmering collard greens with smoked meat, The broth left in the pot was a mineral-rich elixir, treasured as much as the greens themselves. Families poured this flavorful liquid into bowls and sipped it with pieces of cornbread, believing it to restore strength and spirit after long days of work. Some added hot pepper vinegar for a lively kick, while others preferred it plain and soothing. Children learned early never to throw away the potlikker, understanding that its nutrients were too valuable to waste. Neighbors often shared jars with the sick or elderly, turning the simple broth into a gesture of care and healing. Modern kitchens may overlook this tradition, discarding the liquid without thought, but for those who remember, the taste of potlikker carries the memory of community generosity and the wisdom of using every drop the garden and the kitchen could provide. In the 1960s, fatback and cabbage was a reminder that flavor did not come from abundance, but from knowing how to cook with care. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the cleverest ways to turn leftovers into a comforting meal. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmered them in a simple gravy. She poured the mixture into a dish and covered it with biscuit dough instead of pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried both thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen was wasted. The biscuit crust gave the dish substance, making it a true dinner instead of just a side. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was common across homes that relied on ingenuity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival, wrapped in comfort. Food that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had. Chicken neck gravy was the very definition of stretching scraps into a full meal. Poultry was expensive and few families could afford large cuts, so nothing from a chicken ever went to waste. Necks were simmered slowly to release every bit of flavor, then thickened into a gravy with flour and drippings. Poured over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, it transformed the cheapest part of the bird into something filling and comforting. Families looked forward to it because it stretched one bird into several meals, ensuring nothing was thrown away. This kind of resourcefulness defined survival cooking, and for many Black families in the South, it was routine. Chicken neck gravy might not have been glamorous, but it represented pride in making the most out of very little. It also carried the feeling of home, the scent of gravy simmering on the stove, and the relief of knowing everyone at the table would leave fed. Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and old-world methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Okra gumbo with fresh crab told the story of low-country waters and West African roots in every bowl. Thickened by the natural mucilage of okra and deepened with a slow-simmered stock, the stew held blue crab, onions, bell peppers, and fragrant spices that reflected both coastal bounty and ancestral memory. Fishermen brought the catch of the day to markets where cooks bargained for the sweetest crab meat, while home gardeners plucked tender okra pods from vines that thrived in humid summers. The gumbo pot became a gathering place where family and neighbors stood around sharing stories as the aroma of seafood and spice filled the air. Served over rice, Each spoonful carried the taste of tides, soil, and a heritage that stretched back across the Atlantic. In modern times, many turn to faster recipes and frozen ingredients, losing the patient layering of flavor that once defined this dish. Yet for those who remember, nothing matches the soulful depth of a true okra gumbo made with freshly caught crab. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Field pea salad with hot pepper vinegar offered a cool bite for the hottest southern evenings. Tender field peas were boiled until just soft, then chilled and tossed with diced onions, sweet peppers, and a splash of sharp vinegar infused with fiery peppers. The salad balanced earthy legumes with a bright tang that woke the palate after long days in the sun. Served on wide porches as cicadas sang, it accompanied fried chicken, grilled fish, or simply a hunk of cornbread. Home gardeners prized field peas for their reliability in poor soil, and the vinegar peppers were often homemade, steeped for weeks in glass bottles on sunny windowsills. Guests at summer suppers remembered the sting of the vinegar and the gentle sweetness of the peas as the taste of true Southern hospitality. Today, packaged beans and bottled dressings have replaced the careful soaking and seasoning that once defined the dish, but the memory of its crisp, refreshing bite lingers in kitchens where tradition still holds strong. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that blended frugality with comfort in a way that stuck with families for decades. Okra, often grown in backyard gardens, went into a simmering pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick stew. My grandmother would mix simple cornmeal batter, drop spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, and let the dumplings cook until they puffed into tender bites. The texture of the okra thickened the stew naturally, giving it body without needing flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy and sustaining, with dumplings that filled the stomachs of tired workers. It was food that came straight from the soil and stretched further than its ingredients suggested. Children grew up eating this dish as a matter of routine, yet it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a staple that represented both thrift and ingenuity, turning humble vegetables and flour into something worthy of pride at the dinner table. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Share your favorite memory below, like the video, and subscribe to keep these southern flavors alive.